Okay, let me give you a little context about part one of our conversation tonight. Paul is, even though he tries to position himself in this interview as a broker that's trying to help both the city and the union, he came in to help the union. And that means to some extent being friends or associates or working colleagues with John Catanzaro, the FOP Fraternal Order of Police president. That by itself, you're tarring your stuff with horribleness. He is probably one of the worst cops in Chicago. He's probably doing the citizens of residents of Chicago a solid by not being on the street and getting off the street and taking that job in the FOP. At least it gets him off the street, even though it gets him on television all the time. So Paul posts constantly to social media. He's very political in his commentary. So we're going to challenge some of that. And so this runs about, let's see here, it runs about 30 minutes. Then we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back for the last three segments of the show. It's a pretty interesting interview. Part one is tonight. Part two is on Wednesday at 5:30. Okay, I will be back with you after this segment runs. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Chicago Justice Show. Today, my guest is Paul Vallas, ex-CEO of the Chicago Public Schools, mayoral candidate, and he's very proficient on social media and really recently became an assistant of sorts. We'll get into that a little bit with the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police, and negotiating their contract. Paul, thank you so much for jumping on with us again. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's get to one of the questions. Why are you helping in negotiating their contract? Why are you helping the Fraternal Order of Police negotiate with the city?
Well, first of all, I'm actually helping both sides. The FOP invited me to come in and to help them obviously run numbers and obviously kind of like be an expert contributor. I agreed to do so, but I said only on condition that I not be compensated. So I decided to do it pro bono. Plus, the city's team is led by Jim Francic, and Jim and I negotiated, 24 contracts for the city, not only police and fire contracts, but 2 Chicago Public School contracts with the teachers union, successful contracts negotiated on time. So I think my familiarity with all the negotiating parties and obviously, with the financial issues, I think allowed me to I like to think make a contribution. But so I've actually been performing in a pro bono capacity, basically shuttling between both sides and trying to help the process along.
Okay, so on your social media and a lot on the FOP's social media has been this issue of we don't have enough officers, both for the entire department and for local districts. So let's get into the department. How many police officers should Chicago have?
Well, suffice to say that they're probably, I would say, well, last year they didn't fill 1,000 vacancies, and this year in this year's budget they eliminated 614 positions, and of course they're also failing to fill vacancies. So they're probably going to be about 1,500 officers short from, their what I would consider to be their peak level or their appropriated level. So they're clearly not filling all the vacancies that they should have. That's number one. Number two, the strategy that the police department has been employing has only aggravated the problem of not filling your vacancies. So what the strategy has been, in a nutshell, is to create these 2 massive mobile units that are dispatched from one hotspot to another, very often just to sit in cars with flashing lights. And in the process, they've stripped local police districts of, on the average, about 20%. Every district has lost at least 20% of their officers. Some districts have lost more. So you have this situation where, like in the 11th district, there was a Wednesday night, particularly violent Wednesday night, when I think only half the beats were covered by beat cars. So, you can't have community policing if you don't have beat cops. You can't have effective policing when the beats aren't covered. So not only do you have the phenomena of not enough beat cars to cover the beats, but you don't have enough backup. So there's delays. There's not only delays in calls, but there's delays when officers are in trouble. when there's not enough backups. And when you're not filling your vacancies and you're not doing your promoting, you have a problem. For example, the consent decree calls for a 1 to 10 ratio of sergeants to officers. I think it's, what is it, 1 to 20? They're not filling officer vacancies. They don't have enough supervisors. They've attrited out the detectives division. New York has 6,000 detectives. I think Chicago probably has, on the books, they appear to have 1,100, but some officers in the detectives division tell me that they even have fewer officers. And sometimes they dispatch those officers who are not working murder cases, but like the burglar, officers working burglary, to be part of the scarecrow patrol. You know, these cops that are dispatched to sit in their cars with flashing lights in high crime areas, or in some cases it's downtown. So it's a combination of not filling your vacancies combined with the strategy of stripping the local districts and in turn the local beats of officers, so that you can have them sit in their cars downtown, or you can dispatch them as part of these mobile units from place to place. Now, because you have that shortage, that is a product of both not filling vacancies and strategy. They've become increasingly reliant on the existing officers, and in fact, putting them on 12-hour workdays, or for that matter, having them work sometimes 10 days, sometimes more, without a day off. That is a very, very dangerous situation, because you have officers, you have tired officers, you have exhausting officers who are exhausted. And obviously, when you don't have the supervisory infrastructure in place, it just creates a very dangerous situation. And it creates the possibility of having more, perhaps tragic encounters, because the officers are isolated and they don't have the backup and they don't have the resources and they are tired and they are fatigued. So it's not a healthy situation.
I agree on a lot of actually what you said. I knew the scarecrow tactic that he's doing, especially with detectives. He did that in Dallas. So if I want to rip the media a little bit in Chicago, they never looked at what actually happened in Dallas. They took a very cursory look. I called reporters. So I knew what the shtick was. In Dallas, he was known for taking detectives in the months leading up to a city council hearing where he'd have to answer about crime. He was known for taking detectives off of all cases and sticking them in cars with their lights
You
on.
you are so right. He was selected from among the what I call the B group, or the tier 2 group. I think some of the top superintendents that they had their eyes on were reluctant to come here for obvious reasons, but he was within the second tier. And I know police officers in Texas, and when he was selected, they called me and they were quite surprised that he was. So, and if you looked at the crime statistics in Dallas, I think the year before the 2 years previous to him coming here, there was a big spike in crime. I remember there was this article in the Dallas, I think it's the Dallas Times, I don't remember,
Dallas
saying
Morning News.
we should look to Chicago for a model on how to stem our rising crime rate, which was kind of a scary thing when you think about it. But you're absolutely right. And look, I don't think I'm beating him up unfairly. I think ultimately the responsibility lies in the mayor's office, because the mayor's office doesn't micromanage, and they don't micromanage effectively. So, a lot of what's not being done in the police department is a product of, I think, of negligence on the part of the mayor's office. I'm not only blaming her, but the bottom line is, you're supposed to build strong cabinets, dynamic cabinets, and you're supposed to have people in critical leadership positions that have the skills. And I think both he and the first deputy come up lacking. And I think it's a combination of not only the lack of resources, but, you're right. I mean, the Chicago Police Department is one of the larger police departments in the country, but when you're not filling vacancies, significant vacancies, when you're gutting your detectives division, we have New York, I mentioned, has almost 6 times the number of detectives we have. They only have 3 times the number of populations. It's the same thing with LA. But when you're doing those type of things, and then your strategy strips officers from the local districts, it's just not an efficient use. So even the resources that you have, you are simply not using efficiently or effectively, and you're really exhausting. The police department, and that's not healthy for anybody.
So 2 things. One, I agree. I think Brown's totally out of his league here. He did have a couple good years in Dallas where crime went down, but then crime shot back up. and he doesn't want to talk about this. So if you look at the beginning and the end, I think homicides and violence actually went up from the beginning of his term to the end of his term. He did have a dip for 2 years in the middle there when he was chief, but there was also, and we'll have a report out later this summer, there's a lot of crime data manipulation going on in Dallas. And he was known for that, which is what he's trying to do with these saturation teams. But I do want to push back on one thing, and I want to criticize both the police department and the FOP for this. We don't have, no one will do the research to say how many officers we actually need and how many officers should be in each district, right? That 13, the FOP has been, for years and years, we're short of the budgeted number. No one's looked at how did that budgeted number get created?
Right.
And I have sources in the department, some in research and development at the time and command level, and they looked and looked and looked, and the best they could figure out, the 13,750 or whatever the number is it was a negotiated number between Phil Klein and the alderman. It wasn't scientifically based, because you can do staffing reports. Departments all over the country, departments, by the way, all over Illinois, Rockford, Springfield, Aurora, they all do staffing studies to know how many cops they need. So I am a little upset when I hear, well, we're short of the real number. We know this is the real number. No, that 13,750 is just a budgeted political number. So that bothers me when I hear that. And for the FOP and the police, do the research, do it, and let us have a number. And I appeared many years ago at a function for the Illinois Criminological Association or something, and I spoke, and then the FOP spoke, and I said, we need a real number that's scientifically driven and not partisan by either side. Then we can know what the number is and shoot for it. And then you can, once you take that number, you can take it and go by district. What number should be in each district by calls for service. And the FOP got up after me. This is during Mike Shields' time, and said, it's not our responsibility to know how many officers we need on the street. And I was like, well, wait a minute. Yes, it is, because that number will help you make your officer safer. So I've always been a little harsh when I hear, well, we're short. Well, short of what's the number that we know that we need? And I think both, especially the police department, should do that study. Go ahead.
First of all, let me just say that City Hall has always played the game,
absolutely,
the attrition game.
Yes.
Because when I became city budget director in 1993, I came in and there were like 2,000 police vacancies. There were like 11,000, I don't know, I think it was 800 officers. And they were just not filling the vacancies. And that's how they balance their budget every year. So, when people see the budget in the budget book and they say, oh, we got to defund the cops. Well, guess what? They do it through attrition all the time. And Rahm Emanuel had done it. I think Rahm finally went in and in a rare stroke of transparency actually eliminated, I don't know, was it
1,400 positions?
Yeah, 1,500 positions, just like that. And they got heat for it. But the bottom line is he went in. So, so clearly they played the defunding game. And you have to understand, when you're not filling vacancies and you have bad strategy, which makes the vacancy rate, it only amplifies the problem, then you're paying more in overtime. And they're paying record amounts of money in overtime. And what you get when you're paying, hundreds of millions of dollars in overtime, you're getting tired cops, reduced effectiveness. So, but I agree with you. They need to determine what that money and what that number is, but that number needs to reflect a sound strategy. Right now, the strategy they have is unsound. It's not only unsound in terms of just publics, and in terms of what you need to combat violent crime, but it's also unsound financially, because you may be saving money on the attrition side, but you're just pouring it back in on the overtime, on what you're paying in overtime.
And I think that to some degree, you're right. They are doing the funding thing, whereas they're just always not filling vacancies and they're stripping officers, but they're not then turning around and using the money for things that might otherwise drive down crime.
Right.
Like, I am a huge fan. Like, I think if you take the 5 most violent crime neighborhoods in Chicago and you instantly did universal basic income, where these people you would just flood that money into those communities, you would see things happen. We talked about it on the show before. I don't want to go down the TIF rat hole,
No, that's
but
okay.
but
Why
you know,
not?
with almost $1 billion in TIFs,
Yes.
and then you're siphoning money
Yep.
off of the department. And I am a defund person, but I am also for stand up the other responses, whatever those are going to be, before you take money from the police.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And look, as you know, because you've been following me for the better part of 2 years, I've been posting on the progressive agenda side too. I mean, we've had two budgets that have not been progressive by any stretch of the imagination. Look, the mayor's vaunted $750 million East Side West Side initiative. 500 million of that is Rahm Emanuel transportation projects. So it's only $250 million, much of which would have been there during the Emanuel administration. So I see no infusion of money into the poor communities. Let me tell you, you not only have the $1 billion TIF surplus, but if you wanted to raise money for capital, infrastructure, housing, environmental cleanup, because the south side and the west side, you've got areas, I mean, they're environmental calamity areas.
Yes, they are.
I mean, the lead in the water poisoning is a far worse crisis in poor communities than COVID, because there's, the science tells you that even minute amount of lead can do permanent damage. And a lot of the damage that is done neurologically can be linked to violence, bullying, and even crime. There's been studies, and I'll send you the most recent studies, because I've been hounding on this. I mean, why can't they purchase water filtration devices, give it to poor families? I mean, instead of waiting, the new state mandate for lead pipe removal says by 2070, Chicago's supposed to have lead-free pipes. Well, great. That means the kids will spend another 50 years.
Yeah, I know, it's generations of kids you're poisoning.
But something like this, you could issue bonds, amortize the interest, and financials bonds with TIF revenues that, when the TIFs expire, will be freed up. And you can actually bond off that future money now, and you could raise billions for investment in housing, investment in environmental cleanup. You could use the money and leverage that money in the opportunity zones to take advantage of those tax incentives that are there. And you could provide an infusion of investment of dollars into those poorest communities and begin to address the underlying causes of violence in those communities. Now, I'll tell you something else too, because I did, what you may not realize is I worked for 2 years with Sally Yates in the Justice Department, developing a strategy to revamp education and occupational training in the criminal justice system, particularly the Bureau of Prisons. And I spent considerable time working with local people on this and making the rounds and talking about the potential, because the infrastructure is already there. You've got countless organizations and job training programs and support programs. They're all out there, but they're all uncoordinated. And many of them are out there by themselves and not supported. You could literally create a network of adult ed and occupational training programs using an infrastructure that's already there, properly funded and properly supported. And you could get these tens of thousands of individuals who are in some phase of the criminal justice system back into the economy by providing them with adult ed and occupational training and job training opportunities. I mean, we've got all this COVID money. Where's the Job Corps program? I mean, where's the work study program for the high school kids? I mean, some aldermen have told me that as many as 60-70% of the men in their communities are in some phase of the criminal justice system. Yep. They don't have the skills, they don't have the opportunities. Even if they want to go to work for the city, they can't because they have a record. If they want to get a grant, whatever, we could change all that. And the models are there. And while I certainly have talked a lot about cops and things like that, I've also spent a considerable amount of time talking about, how you can create an infrastructure of kind of an educational, occupational training and job placement infrastructure, taking advantage of programs as well as federal dollars that are there that are waiting to be tapped into. And you can get this sea of populace in the communities that if you don't do something with them, you're ultimately not going to change the dynamic in those communities, and you're going to continue to struggle with the violence that we're experiencing.
Michael Rodriguez, now Alderman Rodriguez, but when he was running Little Village Community Development Corp, told me one time, like something like 60% or maybe even higher of men of color it may have been just Latino men, but I think it was men of color between 16 and 25 are completely unattached from anything,
Yeah,
which means they're not in school and they're
I
not
agree.
working. And it's like, wait a minute. I mean, that's a calamity. And no
All the
matter how
Missouri
many,
told me the same thing.
right, no matter how many police you send into that community, if you don't change that equivalent, and I've said the same thing with when I was at UIC getting my graduate degree, they were doing studies with kids in Chicago, and they did one where they were talking about decision making and stuff with trying to change the practice of decision making. And one kid said, "What good is this? I'm going to 30. What am I going to think about being married or being 30? 30 years old and older. Why am I going to save money? It's like, what's the point? This is a black male. I'm going to be dead or
Yeah,
in prison by 30,
I
and
posted something.
that's a horrific failure."
I did an op-ed piece about a year and a half ago. I posted something on Facebook, and I apologize for my post being so long. Somebody referred to me as the Leo Tolstoy of Facebook. You know what I mean? And I'm getting ready to do another post talking about how, if I were mayor, I would direct the schools to create universal work study in the high schools, like Cristo Rey,
Yes.
the famous Jesuit
Yep.
school. There's now 35 of them where the kids go to school and they work at the same time. And it's not like they're creating alternatives to college, but the bottom line is it's extraordinarily effective. And what they could do is they could offer work study electives for all the high school kids. Once they're say 16, 15, 16, work study. And the city controls $24 billion. All the governments that the mayor controls, it's $24 billion. Almost 100,000 jobs, both public sector and private sector contract jobs. You could create tens of thousands of work study jobs, and any like contractor or vendor who got subsidies from the state.
Right.
You go up there, Lincoln Yards, the big subsidy. Everybody's got to create work study. All these kids, you could get into work study jobs. Work study electives. There are so many wasted courses that these high school kids take, not only electives, but irrelevant courses. If you make it to your senior year, most of that senior year is irrelevant anyway. Get the kids in work study, get them off the street. I used it, and that means get all of them off the street, all the kids. I made reference to that the other day, and somebody said that saying get kids off the street is dog whistle. My dad got me and my brothers off the street because he was an accountant and he always got his jobs with his clients. So as early as, 8th grade, I was working, thank God. But the bottom line here is to get these kids in safe and secure environments, whether they're doing internships with, police, fire, EMT, EMS, street sanitation, transportation. Kids who are in the law could do internships with the law departments that get tens of millions of dollars in contracts from the city to settle these legal lawsuits all the time, these legal cases that are brought against the city. There are so many things, construction, you name it. There are so many opportunities for these kids to get in work study. Then they're off the street. They're in the safe and secure. They're being mentored by working men and women who are the best working models in the community. And you're paying them. You're putting money in their pocket. So this is very feasible. And that in itself, because guess what? It's a catastrophe what's happened in the high schools. Do you realize that last year, 9% of those arrested for shootings, 8% for murders, 12% for aggravated battery, 32% for burglaries, 49% arrested for carjackings were school-age children, 17 years and younger. Think about that. And these kids are not coming back to school. What are they going to do? They're the AAA baseball league for the gangs. I mean, they're going to end up in the prison system, or many of these children are going to end up in that. There was a study done. It was in the Tribune research group out of University of Chicago. They're affiliated with the crime lab, and they were saying that if you're arrested for carjacking a car, you're like, I think the number was 70 times more likely to get killed, to get murdered, or to get shot than if you were not. So what are we going to do about it? The school's right there. They've got the largest budget. They've got an $8.4 billion budget. They have $2.5 billion in COVID monies since December. that most of which was not budgeted for. They've got great flexibility to get these kids engaged because it can't be all about the cops. Or even
Oh,
on the, and I'll mention one more thing, like we all promised, all the candidates during the election, we all raised our hand and said, reopen the mental health clinics.
yep.
The mental health clinics. I mean, you know what Rahm saved when he closed the mental health clinics? What did he save? $3 million
He
or maybe I'm
lost.
stating
He
a
lost 100 times that.
fraction of them.
Yep.
You could open a mental health clinic in each of the police districts. They could be community owned, community run, community operated. And first of all, most of the funding can come from Medicaid if you're billing properly, both the state and federal government. There is money in COVID specifically set aside in the COVID Relief Act to fund, mental health services and things like that. They should be opening these centers in every community.
Yep.
Family crisis centers, opioid addiction centers, etc. There's no reason why they can't do that, but they're not doing anything. I don't see any of that going on.
No, because like for better or worse, I mean, there has been no, in my opinion, almost no change. If you look from Daley to Rahm to Lightfoot,
Absolutely.
it's funding the cranes in the South and West Loop and in the main loop and
Right.
in Fulton Market. That's send money, keep the cranes going, keep the power. Like I used to have a office on Wacker and Wabash, and they change the flowers out there on Wacker Drive like 5 times a year. It's beautiful, but can you go a little further west, my friends? Because if you go west enough, you're going to see, I don't know where that shelter is on the west side, but man, it is so depressing. Hundreds of people lined up, right? And they're lined up at food banks. It's a moral decision that when you're mayor, you have to make. And I knew, I said we would know on our first budget. Either the TIFs were going to be changed, he was going to start shutting them down and signaling, no, things are going to change. We're going to spend this money in a different way, and we're going to stop just creating new ones or funding all these cranes, or you're not. To me, nothing can fundamentally change in the city, especially around this funding, unless you deal with TIFs. Siphoning off $1 billion, it just can't happen.
Well, not only did they siphon off $1 billion, but they have like 1.7 billion in cash balances. And again, if you wanted to, you could actually, and I did this when I was in Philadelphia to renovate the schools. I didn't have money, I didn't want to raise taxes, so I issued bonds, amortized the interest, which allowed you to really start paying for the cost of the bonds. The debt service kicked in when my old debt retired, so I was able to take the expiring tax levies for bonds and use them for the new construction, and so I didn't have to raise property taxes a dime. You could do that with TIFs. You could take these, you could issue bonds, amortize the interest, and you could finance those bonds with money that will be freed up when the TIFs, the tax increment financing districts, expire. And you can raise billions to invest on the south and west side, to do environmental cleanup, to take all these houses that are abandoned, that have been in homes, tax delinquency sales and things like that, and turn them over to community-based organizations with grants to renovate them. And you could create tens of thousands of affordable housing units, literally in a short few years. You could do all those things. You could subsidize food courts and what I call social service-based providers, community-owned social service-based providers, job training, opioid addictions. And I know, and having been through those issues with a member of my own family, I am intimately familiar with that. So not to mention the mental health centers, the local job training programs. You could do all those things. Now, I don't see where either of the mayor's 2 budgets have been progressive. And sure, the Progressive Caucus comes out, but they talk about some of these grandiose things that the city doesn't have to. I mean, the city doesn't really have the capacity to go in and basically to tell landlords you have to freeze your rents, or people don't have to pay their mortgages and things like that. I mean, the bottom line is there are some things the city can't do, simply can't do, but there are many things that the city can do. And environmental cleanup, tapping into the TIF monies, both current and future monies now, getting the school district to allocate even just 2% of the budget to do universal work study to all these high school kids are getting paid. They're in work study jobs. They're learning what it is to live and operate in the work world while they're getting their high school diploma, doing the environmental cleanup. These are things that the city can do now. And these are not budget busters. And they'll do more to help create conditions for a reduction in violence and to make it more, to make the police more effective, because they won't have to deal with all the other things that they have to deal with besides policing. Right. And they can do it without busting the budget. And if you begin to revitalize these neighborhoods, it's going to help the city. It's going to help our tax base. It's going to help stabilize. Yeah, it's going to have a long-term growth. Is how the city is going to prosper.
Right, but you have to have a real commitment to making that change and a long-term plan to do it, and you got to make decisions to prioritize those areas over other areas. I think we've been so Rom did it, Daley did it. We're always near broke. We're always near broke. Just don't look at that other set of funds over there, the TIF funds. Don't look at that. Oh, wait, the South Loop changed. That's right. We stuck $500 million of TIF money into the South Loop and funded half of those buildings. Oh, that's why it changed. Yeah, and we have a commitment to some areas and a non-commitment to the other. But you look at everything. It's around the same thing with policing. It's the same thing with the department. We don't have long-term strategies. Everything is about owning the news cycle now in some fashion, right?
Right.
All right, we are back. Thank you for sticking around, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, we have a couple, before I comment, we have a couple questions through Twitter from Donate Your Entire Bag. First one, why should we be setting aside extra money for vacancies that are not being filled? If you're talking about vacancies in the CPD, I am not talking, and if Paul was, well, then poo-poo on him. I was not talking about setting aside that money in any way, shape, or form. What I'm saying is, if you're going to reduce the staffing of the police department, that money, that savings, should not just get obliterated into the budget and you don't know where it went to, and the mayor can do anything she wants with it or anything he or she wants to do with it. No. You're going to cut 500, 100, 600. Daily it left under 1,400, and then that's what Rom cut. Those positions, that savings, every dollar saved should go directly to South and West Side's communities, period. It should be a 1-to-1 match. And that is the only way you're going to sustain change in those communities, in those particular areas. So that's my answer to the first one. If Paul said that, I don't remember him saying it, but if he did, poo-poo on him. I didn't say that. That's not what I meant. Every dollar saved by reducing the size of the police force should be spent on the South and West Sides for investment and economic development and social services that in the end will have a much longer lasting and positive effect on violence and crime than just keep throwing money into policing. The next one is, some students feel work study isolates lower income students. Are there alternatives for equal education? I'm not going to dive too deep into this. It's a little on my bailiwick. But I will say that I've heard things like that. I know an ex-girlfriend of mine, her dad used to literally drive the bus for Cristo Rey. And he used to take the kids and pick them up from their internships where they worked. So, yes, we have a society where everything, if you're in poverty or close to the poverty line, or just low income compared to everyone else, you are going to be disadvantaged. And the problems with our schools and everything thereof is that they do not make up for it. They do not equal the playing field. So I think we need to find ways to equal the playing field and try to do whatever we can to not isolate the students. I am for work study, where and when that can be done successfully. I wouldn't take over all of their education, obviously, but I think a portion of that would be good. I do think we'd have to set up a massive infrastructure for transportation and making sure they're safe. But also, I think Cristo Rey exclusively, or at least back then, was all businesses. I would also do nonprofits and community organizations. I think there's all kinds of things you can expose kids to through that program to allow them to get their feet wet in fields that they might not otherwise know about or have access to. And they can make contacts who know that may also help them. So That's my feeling on those two. Just my few comments on the video before we move on, go to the our quick break, and then on to a little bit about the city council hearing on Friday. Listen, what Vallas is talking about to some degree, he's right on, which is Brown is doing a lot of scarecrow policing, which is putting cops in cars with their lights on in certain areas of the city. And just having them turn their lights on and sit there as a deterrent. Now, because you have such bad reporting in Chicago on crime and violence and on like superintendent picks and stuff, you didn't know this was coming. I started making calls extensively to not only people in Dallas, but the media themselves to know what kind of BS was coming to us from Brown. And this is one of the things. He would do this every year before the city council meetings in Dallas. He would take detectives off cases, I think off of all cases, and have them sit in cars for weeks at a time so that he could drive down the crime numbers a little bit and he'd be able to report that to the city council. So we knew this is coming. It's BS, but this is, we're caught in this never-ending circle. The police have much less to do with crime rates going up or down than the people want to think and let the police want to think. The police take credits for crime going down, and then they take the blame for it going up. And they don't like that. So they'll do anything they can to drive the numbers down, even artificially, even lie about it. And Brown is a pro at that from his time in Dallas. First year or two in Dallas, homicides stayed the same. Then they dipped pretty well. And then by his last year, straight up again, and equal to his first year, if not worse. But if you read his book and you listen to all the propaganda and everything he talks about, it all huge success in Dallas. And ladies and gentlemen, it's staying the same. He had probably not that much to do with. Going down, probably even less to do with. Going up, again, less to do with. Crime is driven by so many societal and social factors. It's so hard to figure out exactly what's going on. But you can't, that will not stop exploitive, useless, horrible, manipulative politicians from blaming them for things. We'll get to that in the next segment. But it also won't stop corrupt, useless, lying, manipulative police officials and politicians for taking credits for reductions that they have nothing to do with.